to NTD China News. I'm Karen Chang. Making headlines this Friday, February 22nd. China and Russia won't support military action against North Korea. Transplant abuse in China and an Australian lawmakers move to ban organ tourism. And the Chinese government admits the country has cancer villages. China and Russia have agreed today that they will block any foreign military intervention over North Korea's nuclear ambitions. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov spoke with his Chinese counterpart Yang Jiechi during a visit to Beijing this week. With both countries having veto rights as permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, their decisions determine what the UN will and won't be able to do. Both Russia and China have condemned North Korea's recent nuclear test, but have also opposed stronger sanctions against the rogue regime. This was North Korea's third nuclear test since 2006, despite strong international condemnation. North Korea is already under heavy sanctions, but support from its major Chinese ally has allowed the regime to persist. Lavrov's visit to China comes ahead of an expected trip by Chinese Communist Party chief Xi Jinping to Russia. It will be Xi's first foreign visit after he takes over as the Chinese president in March. China's environmental pollution has become an issue of high concern in recent decades. Fast growth combined with poor environmental regulations have some academics concerned over China's future. But until recently, the profit above all mentality was the norm. Now the government has acknowledged what are called cancer villages in certain polluted areas.
Thick haze blanketing some of China's most populous cities. It's been making headlines, but some of China's more lethal pollution problems are not so visible to the eye. On Wednesday, China's Ministry of Environmental Protection released a report acknowledging what it calls cancer villages, places where pollution is creating above-average cancer rates among locals. While the term is not new, its use in official reports is. This map was first posted by investigative journalist Deng Fei in 2010. It plots the location of 100 or so cancer villages. Since then, more recent reports estimate there are closer to 400 of these toxic towns. Over the past 3 decades, the mortality rate from cancer shot up 80%. It's now China's biggest killer disease. Stomach cancer rates for rural Chinese are twice that of the world average. Liver cancer is 3 times the global average. Rapid economic growth and lax environmental rules have worsened pollution in recent decades. Governmental reports from last year say that up to 40% of China's rivers are severely polluted. It said 20% of rivers are so toxic that it is dangerous to come into contact with them. Increasing protests over China's environmental degradation have shown citizens' outrage over the poor environmental regulations. In a landmark case last September, a village protest stopped a Japanese paper plant in Jiangsu province from building a wastewater pipeline. The OG paper plant promised to filter its waste before dumping it in the sea, but villagers didn't believe it would keep its word.
As the Chinese regime increases trade relations with other countries, the worsening situation of human rights in the country is also becoming more prominent. This week, the Canadian government has set up an office that will examine the issue of religious freedom around the world, and the suppression of people of belief in China got a specific mention by Prime Minister Stephen Harper.
Chinese human rights activists applauded the Canadian government for establishing its Office of Religious Freedom. Almost 2 years after it was announced, Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper unveiled the office in Toronto on Tuesday. It will deal in countries like Iraq, Egypt, Pakistan, Iran, and others with a history of religious suppression. Given examples of from around the world, Harper made specific mention of China.
In China, Christians who worship outside government-approved boundaries are driven underground, and their leaders are arrested and detained. While Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, and Falun Gong practitioners are subject to repression and intimidation.
The mission of the new office is to promote freedom of religion or belief, something the Canadian government is treating as a foreign policy priority. Chinese writer and democracy advocate Sheng Xue was among those invited to attend the opening.
If this message is transferred to non-democratic countries, including China, it will be a huge encouragement to people of faith.
Global human rights organizations have frequently identified China's Communist Party as one of the worst human rights violators in the world. In particular, the 13-year persecution campaign against the Falun Gong spiritual practice has created the largest group of prisoners of conscience in the world.
The persecution of Falun Gong has attracted the attention of the top leaders in the international community. I hope the international voice can play a positive role to stopping the persecution.
The Office of Religious Freedom will be headed by Andrew Bennett, a practicing Catholic and Dean of Augustine College in Ottawa. The office will focus its work on countries where there is evidence of egregious violations of the rights and freedoms of religious believers.
One of the alleged human rights violations in China that is gaining global attention is organ transplant abuse. The Chinese regime has been accused of carrying out state-sanctioned forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience. Now, an Australian lawmaker is pushing for the state of New South Wales to impose laws to criminalize organ tourism. He says it's making the situation worse in China.
An Australian member of parliament is proposing new legislation that would make it a criminal offence to buy trafficked organs. The New South Wales politician says it would only penalise citizens in his state, but he hopes its effects will be global.
The best way we can do that is pass laws in our home countries to make it a crime to be part of that trade.
The bill targets organ trafficking around the world, but the impact will likely be most felt by China. It's amongst the top destinations for transplant tourism, but with no effective organ donation system, the source of organs is suspect. There is substantial evidence to suggest that state-run hospitals are killing prisoners of conscience to meet the demand of the country's organ transplant business. The largest group of victims identified are persecuted Falun Gong practitioners. Shoebridge says these types of state-sanctioned deaths should not take a back seat in keeping good trade relations with China.
Australia and China have a very robust international trade relationship, but that's based upon both parties' mutual interests. But we cannot allow that commercial relationship to impact on what we think is the right thing to do by way of human rights and what we think is the necessary thing to do to stamp out a trade like unethical transplant tourism.
If passed, the law would make it illegal to receive organs from an unwilling donor. If the removal of the organ could reasonably lead to the donor's death, the recipient could be charged with manslaughter. The maximum jail term would be 25 years.
We would hope that it'll make people think twice before they go overseas and take an organ from someone who hasn't voluntarily donated it.
Shoebridge is opening his bill up for feedback. A stakeholder survey on his website will close on March 7th. He hopes to introduce the bill to the New South Wales Legislative Council this year.
And coming up after the break, Foxconn puts in place a hiring freeze following China's New Year holiday, a new reality for China's liquor market, and these Chinese soccer kids won't be second best for long. A hiring freeze at Foxconn plants across China has raised concerns about the strength of Apple's recent product sales, especially of the iPhone 5. Apple's stock price has dropped since the news of the hiring freeze spread.
Foxconn Technology Group, Apple's largest manufacturing partner, has enacted a hiring freeze at its largest plant in Shenzhen, as well as other plants across China. Apple's stock price dropped 2.4% on Tuesday and continued to drop since the news of the hiring freeze spread on Wednesday. According to a Financial Times report on Wednesday, unnamed sources working with Foxconn said there had been internal notices to halt hiring in response to a slowdown in consumer demand for the iPhone 5. However, the company said in a statement, quote, "Due to an unprecedented rate of return of employees following the Chinese New Year holiday compared to years past, our company has decided to temporarily slow down our recruitment process. This action is not related to any single customer, and any speculation to the contrary is false and inaccurate." Like other factories in China, Foxconn relies heavily on migrant workers who usually travel home for the Lunar New Year holiday. Each year, many do not return, but a Foxconn spokesman said this year they had as many as 97% of employees return. Liao Jiangxing has been working for Foxconn for about 3 years. He says he hopes the company will start hiring again soon.
I hope in the future it will increase the number of employees to lessen our burden. If it doesn't hire more people over the year, we get a bit tired.
Apple's iPhone sales were less than expected during the 2012 holiday quarter. Fears have been growing that the company's command of the consumer electronics market is dwindling. The iPhone accounts for half of Apple's revenue, making it the company's most important product.
Chinese leaders have been trying to tackle the corrupt image of government officials, and one of the measures is to cut back on excessive indulgence. As the Chinese New Year celebrations come to a close, makers of expensive alcohol are feeling the pinch of the cutback.
A bottle of this top-grade Zhou Moutai liquor is going for 1,500 yuan in Shanghai. That's $240 US. But compared to a year ago, the price has fallen by 25%.
Previously, we would have a New Year party every year with distilled liquor and red wine, but this year a meeting was cancelled to save money.
And that falling demand is pushing down prices. In recent years, expensive alcohol at lavish banquets has become a detested symbol of official corruption in China. And Chinese leaders, wary of the Communist Party's growingly tarnished image, are calling for frugality amongst its ranks. Whether cutting back on drinking will improve the public's view of their leaders remains to be seen, but one thing is for sure. As official demand for liquor decreases, its inflated price drops, and ordinary citizens now have a chance to enjoy them too.
Chinese consumers don't see the value in liquor itself, but in its social function. If the price is not high enough, they feel it will make them lose face. If official spending is restricted, that will make the distilled spirit regain its original value, and people will buy it just because it tastes good and has a rare high quality.
For the liquor makers, the reality is a more painful one. Zhou Moutai last month lowered its revenue target for this year. It now expects to pull in 42 billion yuan, or around $6.7 billion. That's $1.2 billion less than what the company hoped for last July.
And lastly today, when a group of kids left China, they were considered only second best. But after more than a year of intense training in one of the biggest soccer-playing countries in Europe, this ragtag team might just surprise everyone.
Sometimes a dream is worth fighting for. That's why these 40 Chinese youngsters have traveled all the way to Portugal with one dream in mind: get better at soccer.
Someone who can become an icon for Chinese football. We think we can have 4 or 5 players here who can, in fact, achieve this.
But believe it or not, these kids are only second best. Local Chinese coaches hand-picked the best players from around the country to play in the Chinese national youth team. Coach Gomes grabbed the next best group of 16 to 20-year-olds. He took them to Portugal last year to train, and at the end of it, they'll see who really are the best players in China.
In these 15 months, the kids had noticeable improvement in their performance during the match. Their pace and rhythm during matches is much better. Their attacking capabilities are greater. All this is the result of successful learning with Portuguese football.
Though these kids have had to deal with a bit of culture shock, they're already feeling the local soccer fever.
The pace of the game is the biggest difference. They play so much faster here in Portugal and in Europe. In general, even just through improving on this aspect, I've developed technically. In China, both in matches and practices, there is no guiding system. Chinese football still hasn't got personality, its own characteristics. I'm very happy to be on this project. Portuguese football is much better than Chinese.
Portugal has been hit hard by the debt crisis, and Chinese investment has been sorely welcomed. Soccer has been exploding in popularity in China, but it's also come with fresh scandal. 2 former Chinese soccer chiefs were found guilty of accepting bribes and jailed earlier this week.
And that's all for this broadcast of NTD China News. For more of our China-related topics, visit our website at ntd.tv or subscribe to our YouTube channel, NTD on China. Coming up next is this week's episode of Discovering China. Stay tuned.